Hello everyone and welcome in today's session.
I'm delighted to have you back in another round of AGC webinars. My name is Susanna Yeti, Account Manager for AGC and the PCB's organizer for this session. Today's topic is Emergency Preparedness and Response Plan, why one size will not fit all. The presentation will include some case studies based on real and potential scenarios in Perth, Western Australia. To talk about this and much more, joining us is PCB certified trainer and CEO of Pirii, Australia, Mr. Mike Gray. Feel free to write your questions and comments and in the question box in the right-hand control panel, and Mr. Gray will answer to them accordingly. Moreover, if you want to participate directly in the discussion with Mr. Gray, you can also raise your hand and then we will unmute your microphone and you can make your questions directly to him. Please, Mr. Gray, you may start the presentation.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. As was said, we'll be looking at the ISO 14001-2015 Emergency Preparedness and Response and why one size will not fit all, which really is something that's followed on from my previous work and research in the early versions of 14001. I constantly see problems with the emergency preparedness and response requirements. So let's have a quick look at some of these things. There's a quick look at who I am, but I'll just swiftly pass over that page. Quick introduction, Pirii Australia. We're an Australian training organisation. We actually trade under two names in Australia as MGTD Pirii and Compass Assurance Training. We deliver vocational qualifications in all areas of management business, but we specialise in audit and risk management, project management, work health and safety and many other areas. We're very proud to be a training partner with PECB and we deliver all sorts of courses. 9001, 14001, 18001, food safety and so on. So we're very proud of our association with PECB. Tonight what we're going to discuss is very much why emergency preparedness and response is such an important component of environmental management, and yet so many organisations that I have to audit and have to work with are all following a one-size-fits-all plan. And then they wonder why things go so badly wrong when things start to happen. I'd also like to look at and have a discussion around how we can use sections 6.1 of the new standard to address the risks and opportunities, and how that can be used by organisations to identify the real issues and not fall into this one-size-fits-all trap that I constantly see, and I'm sure many of you will see the same thing. We'll also be looking at some things that I believe organisations can do to fully comply with the clauses 8.2 and also what a good auditor or implementer should really be looking for or aiming for in to bring themselves within the standard. So there we are. I'm in Perth, Western Australia. We're proudly the most isolated continental capital in the world, and the funny part is that we're actually way closer to Indonesia, Jakarta, than we are to actually Sydney. And we're 4,000 kilometres from our capital city. We are quite a big state, and certainly the population of Perth, 2 million people. We have a massive metropolitan area, and that's just the city area. Of 6,500 square kilometres. We also happen to be very dry. We don't get a lot of rain. We do have water shortages pretty much constantly. We rely on water source, groundwater source and dams. And we are surrounded pretty much by desert. So the environment, especially well, all of our environment, especially our water sources, are pretty precious to us, which is always a surprise when I see some of the stuff that I do see it as I work through each day. Let's have a look at some of the context that I'm talking about. In my experience, I audit many companies, and they all claim to have an emergency response plan, but when I actually look at it, it's some off-the-shelf product that's certainly not been contextualized in any way to the business. I am absolutely stunned at some of the things that I see in emergency response plans, including one organisation had a wonderful emergency response plan that talked all about dangerous goods and hazardous goods, and when I said, oh, okay, where are these in your building? And they said, well, we don't use them. And I'm going, why are you doing that? Why have you got that in your plan? What do you actually look at? And we'll talk about this particular company later on, because when I did find out what they really had, there was absolutely nothing about it in their emergency response plan. Last year, in 2014 and 2015, I was asked to review the emergency plans of 25 contractors for actually a very major organisation, not an Australian one, a major international organisation. And I was absolutely stunned that nearly every one of the emergency management plans, especially out of their environmental management systems, they were almost identical. Which sort of stunned me a little bit, because each one of those companies had a very different risk profile. You had construction, you had welding, you had transport, you had explosives, you had dangerous goods. Each one of those has a completely different profile, and yet here I am looking at emergency plans that are almost the same. Of course, they'd been sort of provided to them. They were told, oh, you need to have an emergency plan, something like this. So that's exactly what they did. They just didn't bother to even contextualize it to the requirements. At a recent audit, the one I was just talking about, an organisation that deals almost exclusively in the storage and installation of rubber products, have a major warehouse which was in a suburb, well, an industrial area surrounded by residential housing, and they hadn't even identified that fire and the resultant emissions from that fire and from the breakdown of the rubber products and the smoke and the water and everything else that was going to come off that would have a significant environmental impact. They hadn't even looked at it. Typically, emergency risk and impact registers I've audited, they rarely ever consider environment. I always said they're usually very good on health and safety, and often they're very good on business context. But poor old environment, once again, gets pushed to one side, and then everybody looks very surprised when you've got a truck on its side, crude oil coming out of the top of it, and everybody's going, oh dear, we've just polluted a whole waterway. And I think that's something that, certainly in my view, we need to start looking at, and ISO 14001-2015 is certainly a good start and somewhere that we can actually work from. Now, I'm just going to show you a couple of case studies, and this first one, this is an industrial area of Perth, but if you have a look, because of the way Perth has grown, we have industrial areas that used to have no housing around them, but now they've got housing all over them and completely surrounded by it. This particular one was a chemical fire in this, actually within this section here. The smoke was actually travelling. We get a thing called the southerly, which comes in the afternoons. This was in the late afternoon when this fire occurred, and it blew all of that smoke, and if you follow my pointer, you'll see it goes across a thing called Bibra Lake Reserve, which is a water source. More importantly, right there is a thing called Adventure World, which was a big sort of smaller Disney-type entertainment park. So you've got all this stuff traveling, all of these, the smoke going across, contaminating the areas. But worse still is that's actually on a hill in this section here, and all of the water from that fire as they were putting out was travelling straight down into the storm water drains and was eventually going to end up in the reserves, which are all water areas. So once again, nobody had really thought about how they were going to control it, and thought very usefully, emergency management people are pretty on the ball and managed to put bunds in. But again, this was a bit of a surprise when it first happened. This next one is even worse. This is actually an older area of Perth, but the section that's in the middle part there has been there for years and years, and actually contains a number of waste recycling facilities. Now, they've had a number of major fires there, and in this particular instance, which is the photograph on the inside, the fire actually travelled all the way up across around Walter Road, all through the back, through Guildford Road, which are all heavily populated suburbs. And a number of the closer places, the closer residential areas, actually had to be evacuated. But worse still was the clean-up from this took weeks, just from the water that ended up in waterways. Even worse, here's a map of just one, around Perth City, that's Perth City in the middle. We have a big river that comes through here. There was a major chemical spill up around the Ascot Perth Airport area, and it all ended up in the river. Now if you have a look on the bottom corner, you'll see the result of that. That particular chemical spill was weed killers. The actual cause of the spill was accidental, but they shouldn't have been where they're being used in the first place. And that was the result. It wiped out pretty much all of the fish in an area right down to Perth City. Now, we don't rely on that river for food, but certainly the damage that did to not just the fish, but also to a lot of the flora around the riverbanks, etc., was absolutely stunning. So let's have a look at what ISO 14001:2015 says. Well, it's pretty simple. The organisation needs to implement and maintain the processes and prepare for and respond to potential emergency situations as have been identified in 6.1.1. And certainly within the extract, when we look at it, within the scope of the environmental management system, the organisation needs to determine the potential emergency situations, and we need to look at those and ensure that we understand them so that we can reduce any impact on the environment. Which leaves the question, how come then do we go to so many organisations when you look at their emergency management plans, they're almost the same? I have to ask myself, what's happening, what's being missed? And I think it's something we all need to start looking at if we're going to be serious about bringing in good environmental management, emergency management. Now, this particular case study is actually close to my heart because I actually live out around this area, actually over in the back of near this park that's over in the corner here. The section in the middle with the red is actually quite a large industrial area. But you'll notice there's Lake Gnangara. Now, we have a thing called the Gnangara Water Mound, and that's where a lot of the water, the fresh water for Perth, actually is drawn from within this whole Lake Gnangara Park and from within the mound. And an organisation that I audited recently has a massive rubber factory or rubber components factory in this section, in this area. When we were doing the audit, I had a look at what they had in their emergency management plan and what they would be doing with waste from fires and spills, etc. And actually there was nothing in there that talked anything about fire or the resultant waste that would come from fighting the fire with foam and water as would be required. What stunned me even more was when I said to the people who actually ran the factory, well, could you tell me where, what the people next door have and how that would impact if they have any sort of fire? And they couldn't tell me. Then I said, well, have you told them about what you've got? And they said, no, of course we haven't. But the asbestos roof, which was quite a big area, started to smoulder and then caught fire, and everything else under it was on fire. The resulting fallout actually went across Perth and across all of them in the residential area that is close to the West Perth, Leederville area. It was so bad that the residents were required to either evacuate or stay within their homes, turn off air conditioning, which in the middle of summer is not the best thing in Perth, and the streets surrounding had to be evacuated. Nobody had even thought about this until somebody, when the fire brigade had arrived and looked at the roof and said, "You do realise that it's asbestos." Now, it had not even been considered, once again. So, I think my point is very much that we need to start identifying the real issues. If we're going to be serious about emergency management and meet the requirements of the standards, and by the way, it's not just 14,001. If you look at the new, or certainly even 18,001 says we need to start considering risk profiles in regards to emergency management. We need to start being serious about conducting full and proper risk management processes as are required. We actually need to look at the threats and the impacts when something's going wrong, not just when it's going right. So many times the sort of stuff that I see in risk registers is relatively what I'd call wishy-washy. It's the easy stuff. It's small spills in the yard. It's, you know, a truck losing 150 litres of fuel. It's things like some chemicals being inadvertently poured down drains. Oftentimes you don't see the major stuff. And if you challenge people to say, well, look, if we put that in there, somebody's going to make us do something about it. And that's a bit of a problem. We need to start focusing not only on the threats and the impacts within business and premises and grounds. We need to start getting people, encouraging people to talk to the neighbours, talk to the businesses around them. What are their risks? What are their threats? If they have some sort of incident on their site, how will that impact us? Will our site, or could our site be in a position where it's actually going to exacerbate the problems for the neighbour? Or worse still, will the neighbours' impact cause us to have severe problems? The other thing I often don't see in emergency management plans, and yet certainly in Western Australia, we're a really massive state, is the impacts of delayed response, not just after hours and weekends, but also things like distance. In Western Australia, we could have up to 4 to 6 hours response for a hazmat team to get from Perth to the area, and sometimes it can be as much as 12 hours. It's such a big state. After, you know, the mine sites that we have, they have some limited resources. But if you start rolling trucks, or you have chemical spills, or you have major fire impacts, major environmental damage, the cleanup, or even just the response, just the first response, could be delayed significantly. Again, the number of times that I see in risk registers, or even in any of the other risk assessment tools that are around, where they've considered delayed response, is sadly very low. We need to consider the threats and impacts for our neighbours. As I said, if they've got an emergency, how are they going to affect you? How will they affect others? And we also need to consider the maximum reasonable outcome. If you've got a large organisation with a large facility, a large warehouse, and you haven't considered what could happen if the whole area, certainly if it's an open warehouse area, was impacted on fire, then you are not considering your maximum reasonable outcomes. Now, we must be considering maximum reasonable outcomes, not just the easy stuff. And a perfect example was the site I audited a few weeks back, where they had some chemicals in couple of storage areas, 200 litres storage areas. And then I said to them, well, what would you do if you have a breach in those areas? How are you going to protect it? And they looked at me and said, oh, that would never happen. And I said, why not? They said, well, nothing can go near it, nothing can breach it. And I said, well, why have you got a truck reversing up your driveway and it's within about a metre of it? They said, yes, but there's a bollard in the way. I said, so the truck couldn't push that bollard over. No, they weren't considering the maximum reasonable outcome. They were just considering what happens if we have a little bit of an incident. And I think we've really got to start looking at this with a little bit more caution. What is the maximum reasonable outcome? Look at the maximum reasonable consequence and its probability. And that's the largest realistic or credible consequence from an event, considering the credible failure of controls. So if, as an auditor or as an implementer, you can see something, then that has to be a pretty good indication that needs to be considered as an outcome. I understand that it's generally a higher consequence than most likely consequence, and it's certainly less severe than the worst case consequence, which considers all of the failure of all controls. But you know something? When you have major accidents and major incidents in industrial areas, certainly ones that deal with explosives, chemicals, rubbers, all other sort of significant products that can harm the environment, then maybe we do have to consider that area and look at it as the maximum reasonable outcome. But certainly that's not something I'm seeing at the moment, and as I said, I think 14,001 2015 is a really good way, gives us all an opportunity to improve our processes and certainly improve our emergency management. Now, we need to start encouraging people to develop meaningful emergency management plans. If you read the standard, unless the requirements of section 6.1 has been met, then the requirements of section should be 8.2. It's highly unlikely because, one, the organisation won't understand the real situations within its management systems, and certainly not including the threats and the impacts. If you don't recognise something, if you haven't understood it, if you haven't identified, there's no way in the world you're ever going to be able to manage it. And you're certainly not going to be able to plan for when something goes wrong if you haven't realised that something's going to go wrong. The organisation's not going to be able to prevent or mitigate something that is not identified. All of us who teach risk will all say the same thing. If you haven't seen it, if you don't understand it, you can't do a thing about it. The organisation certainly can't effectively review, revise and test their management plans and reactions without understanding what to prepare and train for. Again, you can't train for what you don't know. You can't review something you haven't identified, and you can't revise and test something that you don't even know exists. And organisations can't deal with their other interested parties, their neighbours, other departments, if they haven't understood what they need to be talking about. They need to talk to the people next to them, talk to their neighbours, talk to their stakeholders. What have you got near you? If you're working near, if you've got a factory that's anywhere near water sources, then you need to understand the impacts if something goes wrong and where all the water from any firefighting is going to end up. If you're transporting dangerous goods, if you're transporting fuels, if you're transporting stuff that's got to run through towns and small towns in the bush, if you turn that truck over and it leaks its contents into the local waterway, how are you going to look? Think about the damage that that's going to do to their water sources. What about to the rest of the ground? Crude oil impacting into the ground will last for years if it's not cleaned up properly. And that's just, these are just small examples of some of the things that we deal with in Australia, and I'm sure the rest of you do in the rest of the world. You know, in order to ensure that an organisation is truly meeting the requirements for effective emergency preparedness and response, auditors and implementers need to be doing the homework. We actually need to think about what we're going to see before we get there. We need to fully understand the organisation's process and seek out the way we can work with their activities. You know, have there been emergencies in the past? What were the outcomes? You know, the number of people I say to them, have you looked at what people who are similar to you, what sort of accidents they've had, what sort of incidents they've had on their sites, what have been the environmental outputs from those sites? And they usually look at me, no, we're just worried about ourselves. It requires homework to go out and do those things, find out what the real areas for discussion are. Look at, are there any real known threats to the environment? What is around it? Okay. Will the organisation's locality contribute to additional threats and impacts onto the environment, the whole environment of that area? I find Google Earth an absolutely great resource for getting an understanding of the area of impact. When I go to any sort of storage facilities, chemical facilities, transport facilities, all of those areas, I actually get on Google Earth and have a good look at the locality, look at the topography, and just have get a good idea and a good feel for if there is an incident on that site, where is the outfall from that going to end up. So we should be reading any risk and emergency registers in conjunction with their emergency management plan. I find it's much easier to do the two together, so I can have a look at it and say, well, they've identified this as a risk. They've identified it as a possible source of harm at some stage to the environment. Have they actually mentioned this within their emergency management plan? Have they looked at all of the identified scenarios and have they been addressed? Are they actually the scenarios realistic? And if they are, have they been fully considered? You know, has the organisation considered the first response needs? It's all very well, and a number of times I get this, and I'm sure the rest of you do, where you say to them, well, what's your emergency response? And I'll say, in Australia it's 000. Oh, we'll ring 000 and let the fire brigade do it, put it out and look after it. And they find it very difficult when I say, well, have you got anything in there that's going to stop the water ending up into the local riverways, the local lakes, etc.? And they just look going, well, we've not considered that. If they're more remote, have they got the necessary equipment, and has the training been undertaken, and can they repeat that? The training, have they undertaken realistic scenarios, realistic exercises? Have they got a process for effective communication to the interested parties? Now, people are much happier and will accept that things will go wrong if at least somebody's talked to them and they actually know that in the event of emergency there is a plan for doing something about it. And have they got real evidence and effective testing and review if you're auditing? Can you actually see realistic stuff? And did that testing and review include other interested parties? Certainly in one of the areas of Perth, which is a relatively large industrial estate that has a lot of transport and dangerous goods transport organisations in it, they actually run combined exercises, which is great. And certainly some of our chemical manufacturing areas, they have full area exercises. And I think that's something we should be encouraging wherever practical. So I think as a conclusion, to my mind there's a lot more to meeting the requirements of the emergency preparedness response requirements of ISO 14001 2015 than just paying lip service. I think the world is a more mature place, and I think it's time that we could up the game, if you like. Certainly it's nothing new. emergency management and preparedness and response was a requirement of the 2004 standards. But on a daily basis, I'm certainly seeing poorly prepared emergency response plans and practices. And as I said right at the start, OH&S and the business focus is usually pretty good, but there's very little thought to the environmental impacts. And yet, when we think about it, which is the impact that lasts the longest? Well, in my mind, the environment's going to suffer. And trying to fix the environment once it's been damaged can be not only costly, but it can also be a long, hard slog for everybody. So by properly considering the requirements of the standard and ensuring that that has been done in the context of the organisation, they've got an opportunity to practice really responsible environmental management at all levels of the business, and certainly under even the most adverse conditions. And to my mind, I think that's a message that is well worth taking across industry as we bring this new standard into fruition. So I'd like to thank you for attending the webinar. There's some contact details for me if any of you are interested in having a chat later on. I am a pretty passionate person when it comes to the environment, but then I guess when you see where I live, we really do want to protect our area of the world. So thank you very much. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take those now.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. We will go ahead and take some time for questions now. The first question is, do I need to use a consultant in the process of preparing the emergency plan?
Certainly not. There's certainly nothing wrong with using consultants, so before anybody says, oi. But the big problem with a consultant is they don't work in your organisation. Certainly the consultant can assist you to build that plan, but don't make the mistake of saying to the consultant, oh, it's all yours, I'll just stand back and let you produce a plan. If that organisation is not consulting with the consultant and going through and making darn sure that that consultant fully understands the risks and the profile and context of that organisation, then you're not going to have an effective plan. So yes, by all means, use a consultant, but make sure that you work with the consultant. Don't just rely on the consultant to do your job for you.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, according to your experience, what are the most common problems that may come up when preparing an emergency response plan?
Well, probably the biggest one was the one I was talking about earlier on, that people tend to see that look for the things that are very obvious and right in front of their faces, but they forget about the more difficult ones to identify. They also will may misidentify something. They might say, well, the biggest risk to this organisation is a health risk from the chemicals we use. But if there's an emergency with those chemicals, it now ends up in waterways, it ends up in drains, it contaminates land, it can contaminate landfills, it can contaminate whole sections of the area. I think it's a lot of the time it's just people completely misunderstand their own risk and actually misunderstand what they should really be looking at.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, what should employee training include and how often should training take place?
Oh dear, people ask me this one all the time because we actually specialise in certain types of emergency training. But I think you've got to look at your organisation and consider what do we need to do as a first aid for this incident. Obviously nothing will ever overtake the professionals. Those are people who are trained every day to work with the risks and hazards and emergency management every day. But we should be including simple stuff like, if you've got chemicals, do people know how to contain spills? Do people know how to use a spill kit? Do they know how to block stormwater drains in the event of a spill? Do they know how to build if you've got some sort of oils or fuels or petroleums around, do they know how to make a very simple bund that will at least in the initial stages contain the emergency to a certain extent? I don't think we need to be teaching, well, it depends on the size of the organisation, but for the everyday organisations, just teaching people a little bit of first aid to at least control to a certain extent the emergency before the professionals get there. I think that's enough. But I think we should be talking to the people in our workplace and saying, what can you do? What skills have you got? You'd be amazed, certainly in Australia, how many people are actually members of what we call bushfire brigades. They actually have fire training, so they're actually quite competent in the use of extinguishers and some other emergency management equipment.
Okay, thank you. And the last question is, what is your general advice for the organization regarding the emergency response plan?
My general advice, make sure you've got one, make sure you've based it on your well thought out, well constructed risk assessment of your organisation. Contextualise it to what you do, contextualise it to your location. Talk to everybody involved in the process. Get everybody's input. If you do that, you'll have an emergency management plan and emergency process that will actually stand the test of time, and be prepared to change it. You know, as industry changes, we get new chemicals, we get new equipment, and you'd be amazed how many times you see emergency management plans and they're still talking about equipment and machinery that actually hasn't been seen on that site for the last couple of years. So I think take your time, get it right, and then make sure that you continue to review, revise it, and work with it to suit yourself. Remember, it should support your organisation. It shouldn't be a problem to the organisation.
Thank you, Mr. Mike. We actually have one more question. Mr. Gareth wants to know, are there any supporting standards that can be imparted to organization leaders to pursue them in conforming and taking ER seriously?
Well, the one that jumps to my mind is not a standard. It's actually called, certainly in Australia, I'm sure it's pretty much every other country of the world, is things like the laws that say that you should make sure that you are controlling your business, that you're controlling your outputs, and that includes things like controlling any emergencies in your areas. And they come under things like the OH&S statutes, they come under environmental statutes. As for the rest of the standards, I mean, there's a whole raft of standards that talk about emergency management. Now, I have to explain that because I work under the Australian emergency management processes, most of ours are the AS standards. But I'm sure every country will have its own standards for emergency management. We have a thing called in Australia, the AEMA, which is the Australian Emergency Management Standards. Any one of those, you know, they've been written well, and I guess for every other country you will have something you can certainly rely on. And I know that's a bit of a cop-out, but it's probably the best way of explaining it, because I'd hate to give somebody advice on something that that wasn't available in their own country.
Thank you, Mr. Gray, once again. I would also like to thank all the attendees for taking the time out of their busy schedule to join us. We hope you enjoyed this webinar. We received all your questions, and because the time is limited, we will answer to your questions individually by email. Also, don't forget to check PCB's webinar schedule on our website, pcb.com, or our official social media network. See you next Friday. Bye-bye.